Ladies and gentlemen, April 2017 marked an important time in computing history, the launch of AMD's much anticipated Ryzen series of processors. AMD made lofty claims in the run-up to the launch of these CPUs, claiming that we would see up to a 40% IPC improvement over their older FX line of CPUs. Gamers, tech journalists were cautiously optimistic. Would AMD really be able to achieve these claims? Well, the answer was a resounding yes, they would, smashing their performance targets and hitting a 52% improvement over the previous generation of CPUs. Very impressive indeed. But AMD have not stopped there. While the launch of the Ryzen series CPUs certainly scuppered a lot of the hype surrounding Kaby Lake, Intel were quick to launch Coffee Lake, which AMD have since countered with Zen Plus, which is a 12nm shrink of the original Zen architecture, along with a refreshed motherboard lineup, the 400 series. My name's Paul, and in this RedGaming.com video, we're going to be taking a look at MSI's X470 Gaming Plus motherboard. Because there is so much to discuss with the new generation of Ryzen processors, we're conducting this motherboard review in a separate video, but there is also a lot of other information on Ryzen, such as IPC gains, information regarding gaming performance, impact of memory speeds, SMT testing, and much more besides, which you can find linked in the video description, or you can go ahead and check out the playlist.
This motherboard is one of the cheaper X470 offerings out there, available for just £120 or $130 US, and for budget-orientated gamers and the enthusiasts out there, it does promise a lot, but does it deliver? We'll investigate the motherboard's BIOS and feature set, build quality, and MSI features such as Nahimic audio, overclocking, and general motherboard stability. Do be aware that the X470 Gaming Plus motherboard and Ryzen 7 2700X CPU were sent to us by MSI for the purposes of this review, but this is not a sponsored video and the hardware has since gone back to MSI and thus all opinions are our own. Oh, and if you'd like to see other content on Ryzen, including the impacts of memory speeds for gaming, and if you should leave legacy mode or SMT enabled to disabled, do feel free to check out the links in the video description. A quick overview of the system specifications. A Ryzen 7 2700X, the motherboard an MSI X470 Gaming Plus, rather obviously, Ballistics Tactical Elite memory running at 3266 MHz, an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1080, Kingston HyperX Savage 240GB SSD for the operating system, and a crucial MX300 750GB SSD for the games, as well as of course Windows 10 64, which is patched to the latest version.
Clearly, aesthetics are a matter of personal preference, but MSI's X470 Gaming Plus motherboard, we have greys, blacks, and muted red tones as the order of the day. It's typical for MSI's aesthetics, but they've opted to go for slightly duller tones. But it does work rather well, particularly for those who want a motherboard which just fits into various case themes. MSI have also been rather sensible with the spacing of various components of the motherboard, and various headers, RAM slots and ATX power points don't interfere with one another. A slight gripe are the dual CPU power connectors found at the top of the board, which are a little close to VRM heatsinks. It's not a problem for roomier cases or if you're building the system outside on a test bench, but if you're trying to unplug them and reroute cables and you have larger hands and a smaller case, it might be an issue, but this is a pretty minor gripe. Oh, and speaking of dual CPU connectors, regarding the 4-pin power connector, if your PSU has the connector, great, do feel free to plug it in. If it doesn't, then this connector isn't really going to benefit you that much, even during overclocking. Even the Ryzen 7 2700X's power draw when heavily overclocked is only around 200-250 watts. At most under load, therefore the standard 8-pin EPS is going to provide more than enough power. Touching further on power distribution, let's move over to the VRM design. You'll spot the 8 power phases which provide power delivery to the V-core, the most critical set of phases on the motherboard. And while you might be tempted to think that this is an 8-phase design, you'll also spot an RT8894A Richtech phase voltage controller, which is a 4+2 design. The takeaway here, without getting into the nitty-gritty of how VRMs work in power distribution on motherboards, is we have a dual 4-phase design. This may disappoint some who are expecting a proper 8-phase design on the motherboard, but do be aware that 4 phases should be ample for a Ryzen 7 2700X processor. We had no issues whatsoever sustaining over 4 GHz on all cores during our stress testing.
And the motherboard handled everything flawlessly, with voltages nice and stable. If this board were for a Skylake X or Threadripper CPU, of course this would be a very, very different story. But for a Ryzen 7 CPU, you'll have absolutely no issues. The first PCIe slot is a 3.0x16 and is outfitted with MSI steel armor, although the second PCIe 3.016 slot and the PCIe 2.016 slot are not. You do get three-way crossfire support here, but do be aware that if you're installing 2 GPUs, you'll only be operating your GPUs in PCIe 3.0x8, and a third card would only be running on PCIe 2.0x4. And it is not available if you choose to install an M2 PCIe SSD in the M2_2 slot. Do be aware that these are limitations not of MSI's motherboard design, and so much just a fact of life of the Ryzen chipset and the number of PCIe lanes. But let's just be honest, there should be ample number of expansion slots for most mainstream users or gamers. Besides, with a motherboard sitting at just $130, we suspect a lot of people won't opt for more than 2 GPUs in tandem anyway.
Memory support with this motherboard is frankly robust, capable of hitting 3466 MHz thanks to AXMP, and our crucial Ballistics Tactical Elite memory was running at 3266 MHz without any issues at all.
Its stock clocks, by the way, are 3000 MHz. Of course, Ryzen is a dual channel architecture, and this particular motherboard supports 64 GB as you would expect. Storage is taken care of by 6 SATA 6 GBS ports and 2 x M2 ports, which are key M's, and the X470 chipset supports RAID 0, 1 and RAID 10 for SATA. As you'd also expect for any modern motherboard, there's also more USB slots than you'll likely ever need. 2 USB 3.1 Gen 2 slots are provided by the ASMedia ASM1143 chipset, and there's a further 4 USB 3.1s, but only Gen 2 Type A on the back panel, and this is combined with a 6 USB 2.0 ports, although 4 are through internal connectors to your case. You can also plug in another set of 4 times USB 3.1s to your ports too, should you wish, and let's face it, you probably will, because it's more convenient than reaching at the rear of your case. There's also the usual connectors for fans, pump connectors, front audio panel connectors, and more. Rather nicely, there's also a clear CMOS button, handy if something does go wrong with your overclock, and you can upgrade your CPU or any other reason. A small gripe with this button is its placement. It can be blocked with a fully loaded system with lots of headers connected and the 6 PCIe slot used, although we suspect this will not really affect the majority of the users out there. We do also wish there was a power and reset button included on the motherboard too, but this would have increased the cost, and so their absence is just completely understandable. For those of you who are interested in adorning your case with LEDs, this motherboard offers MSI's Mystic lighting control, and lighting is located on the underside of the motherboard, on the edge where the RAM slots are located. You can choose colours and modes and synchronize the colour of your hardware and your rig, or simply disable the lighting totally if that's your preference. Of course, this is a more budget-orientated board, so we can't expect the same level of lighting customization found in more expensive offerings. Upon entering the X470 Gaming Plus motherboard BIOS, you're immediately greeted with a friendly and familiar looking screen, with many of the more advanced features tucked away under the advanced menu, which you can either click on or simply press F7, which is the elite way of doing things. The top of the BIOS display tells you the system specs, processor, DDR4 speed, idle temperatures, which is handy to remind you if you've forgotten to plug in that CPU fan in your eagerness to build your system, boot order and other obligatory options and information. Going into advanced mode grants you access to considerably more tweaking options, such as integrated peripherals, USB configuration, advanced SATA and hard drive options, and much more. And overclocking settings are where options for adjusting memory timing, CPU and RAM frequencies, voltages are located. Indeed, you can gain a few extra options by telling the motherboard you're not just advanced, but you're a damn expert, and switching to OC Explore mode. To such a bold statement, everything is pretty much what you'd expect, and we had no issues with RAM compatibility with both the Kingston HyperX Savage we have on hand, or the Corsair Vengeance DDR4 3000, which we conducted all our tests on, albeit at 3266 MHz. Other features include a board explorer, allowing you to see what components your motherboard is detecting, perhaps helpful prior to installing an OS. M-Flash, where you can easily install a USB drive and flash it to the latest BIOS without the need of a boot disk or to be within Windows. And there's also a top game boost option, which enabling it increases CPU base frequency by 450 MHz. We conducted all our tests without this, but did check it worked and we didn't have any issues with stability. We simply clicked the button, left the voltages on auto, and away we went. MSI have outfitted the X470 Gaming Plus motherboard with the Realtek ALC892, which supports 7.1 surround sound, headphone amp, SPDIF I/O, and more, and fully supports Nahimic software. Looking over our review sample, MSI used Japan-produced audio capacitors made by Nippon Chemicon. Nahimic certainly adds a lot of additional quality to the recordings, and there's a world of difference between enabling and disabling it. We actually did purchase a set of cables for the purpose of capturing audio directly from the motherboard for this review. Unfortunately, we realised these cables were damaged and hadn't noticed it at the time of testing, which leads to some of our audio captures having hiss and feedback, thus we can't really use them in the review. But we did manage to capture audio recording using Nahimic 2, and you can see the difference yourself.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Nahimic audio does work very well, although it does not manage to match the sound quality of a 7.1 or a 5.1 surround sound dedicated setup, and I personally dislike the feature being enabled for that purpose. But with that said, with the bass boost, treble enhancer and voice enhancer, I have to say that they make a profound difference in your audio experience, and I would highly recommend that you do enable them should you purchase this board. Despite this being on the cheaper end of the X470 motherboard spectrum, we didn't have any issues whatsoever overclocking our Ryzen 7 2700X processor. There are actually several methods available for overclocking thanks to both MSI and AMD, so let's explore them.
The first is to overclock using the Ryzen Master Control Panel, or MSI's Command Center. From a personal preference, I think that the Ryzen Master Control Panel is the better bang for buck, as it allows you to enable or disable legacy mode and SMT very easily, plus other tweaks. As a side note, we covered the performance difference with these modes in a separate video, which is linked in the video description. You can overclock the CPU in 25 MHz increments on just a single core or multiple, adjust RAM frequencies and timings, and it's pretty intuitive and easy. If you're enabling a specific overclocking feature for the first time, you may need to reboot, but after that you're generally good to go. We overclocked our sample CPU to 4200 MHz fairly easily, but likely would have backed off to about 4100 MHz for our day-to-day usage on all cores. MSI also provide a rather healthy dose of overclocking options within the BIOS, and frankly they're pretty easy to tweak. You can override any of these options within Ryzen Master. So for example, if you were to set the CPU clock speed to 3900 MHz within the BIOS, but within Ryzen Master you turn on overclocking control and set it to 4 GHz, this will result in your CPU running at 4 GHz despite what your BIOS is set at. Either way, if you're wishing to minimize applications loaded at startup or just want access to more functionality, MSI's BIOS does give you more control for voltage and memory timings, for example, then you're good to go here. All but the most hardcore overclockers will be happy with this motherboard, I suspect. The other option is to click on Gain Boost, which places a permanent 450 MHz on the CPU-based frequency. This could be quite handy in conjunction with AMD's own Ryzen CPU functionality such as CentMI and XFR2. The
motherboard did not give us any issues whatsoever with voltage drops, but we do feel that we were hitting about the maximum capability for cooling of the Wraith Prism. over 41 or 4200 megahertz, it just wasn't worth the additional heat and noise created. Now this of course wasn't a limit of the actual motherboard itself, rather the silicon of the Ryzen 7 2700X we were given, along with the Wraith Prism. If you had good luck in the silicon lottery, or you had a really good AIO, you may get better luck.
Our Ballistic Tactical Elite 3000 MHz memory also happily ran at 3266 without any complaints, simply by clicking the appropriate speeds in the BIOS, and we also used XAMP2 for our timings. One of the definite improvements of the Ryzen 2000 series and the 400 series motherboards are improvements to memory support. MSI's motherboards does support speeds of up to 3466 MHz, but our RAM kit wasn't capable of hitting those speeds. Still, as we discovered in our RAM clock speeds testing, link in the video description, hitting 3 GHz or so on RAM is generally enough for most applications not to be held back by lack of bandwidth.
While we do risk repeating ourselves, the phase design did not impact our overclocking whatsoever. Oh, and just a quick note once again, if you do only have a single 8-pin EPS power connector, then don't fret. The additional 4-pin power connector during our testing made no difference at all with either voltage stability or overclocking performance. MSI's X470 Gaming Plus motherboard is a great buy for the price and is more than capable of powering an 8-core modern-day Ryzen processor. For only around $130 US, it's hard to argue against the sheer value proposition here. Yes, it does not have all of the features of its more expensive cousins, but for folks who are shopping in this kind of price range, you don't necessarily care about having lots of LED lights or the power switch on a motherboard or anything like that. Instead, what you do want is a stable motherboard, you want the ability to overclock, you want decent driver support, and of course, you want the motherboard to last. And in those instances, MSI's X470 Gaming Plus motherboard does deliver. So if you are in the market for a motherboard of around this price point, we do suggest you check this out. With all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. Normal stuff, like, share, comment and subscribe if you have enjoyed the video. And hopefully, well, I'll see you again soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.